working with security researchers and security analysts, whether it's ones and twos within security operations centers.
Yeah.
Without a miss, every single one of them, they're so fascinated with the industrial control system world or OT cybersecurity world. The idea that something could go boom instead of just shutting down a mail server, right?
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
Hi, I'm Craig Duckworth, and today with me I have Roger Hill from Hillstrong Group Security. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Hey, great to be here, Craig. Thank you.
So I guess let's start with a little background about yourself. Why don't you give the listeners some background on you, what you've done, and then we can kind of jump in. I really want to get your perspective of kind of what you've seen change and evolve in the security of the OT environment since your infancy, I guess, in the OT environment, because I'm sure there's been a lot of change, a lot of migration. But let's start a little bit about your background, your history, and then we can kind of go into what you've seen over the lifespan of your career.
Wow, Craig, I think you just asked me how old am I?
I did, but kind of in a roundabout way.
Yeah. So listen, going back, I've been in the industrial automation world for let's just call it 30 years, right?
Okay.
Long before we had the name OT or operational technology. So when you pose the question of what's changed, what's really interesting is I would say I definitely predated any notion of cybersecurity, right? So I think, if we go back to the pre-Stuxnet days, the idea of, quite frankly, from an industrial automation, having spent over 16 years with Siemens and, a couple of years with Rockwell. So I definitely have the time with industrial automation vendors, but just looking at it from that system test in a pre-Stuxnet world, your system test never even considered a test scenario of someone purposefully trying to attack a system because we're coming from such an engineering-driven world. So I think from that post-Stuxnet world, that's where there was that first wave, which was really the evangelism, raising awareness of, hey, we really need to pay attention and secure these systems now, right? And I think that early work in that post-Stuxnet world was really, okay, what are the sectors that really need to focus on this? I think early on, oil and gas was really leading the way anyway. That's where most of the early cybersecurity work. I think when you look at North America specifically, it was largely not only anything offensive, but largely it was a compliance play around NERC-CIP. And I think there's pros and cons, but that's time for a different episode, I think. So I think when you start looking at the other sectors in that first wave, we clearly saw from our market research that the chemical sector was really leading that wave. And manufacturing was not convinced Russia or China were out to get them. They were right. Right? They didn't view themselves as critical. So I think one of the things that really changed in that post-Stuxnet, then we went through a secondary wave, which was all of the emerging tech startups of specific OT-designed cybersecurity solutions. That was a real shiny object syndrome wave, right? And now I think it's really interesting because ransomware has changed the dynamics, I think, in terms of the threat. Because now the manufacturing sector, they've been targeted, either number one and number two target for ransomware. Ransomware, quite frankly, has emerged as a completely different threat now with ransomware as a service.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's kind of quite the evolution.
So if I were to unpack that, I would say everything has changed.
You could even go back to say one of the early foundational elements was the adoption of the Ethernet-based communication protocols at that field device network and control system network layers, right? From the old RS-45, RS-232.
Okay. Yeah, so you brought up the shiny object, new OT IDS / technologies, whether they are IDS, they are secure remote access, they are intrusion prevention, whatever the flavor is. There's a lot of them, but I think that as the market is maturing, as the OT environment is maturing and organizations are accepting that there are purpose-built technologies for this industrial space, we are starting to see a shift. Are you seeing the same thing?
Yes, and I think there's another shift that I don't hear many people talking about right now. And what I have purposely, what I have specifically experienced myself, formerly at the Kudelski Group and now within Hailstrong, is a lot of the large manufacturers. I think in that early shiny adoption phase, what was happening is you had acquisitions of this technology not based upon system requirements, definitions. Mm-hmm. Instead, it was really, everything was backwards. It was acquiring technology and then determining what can that technology do for us and then build a program around it. And that's completely backwards, right? Mm-hmm. So I think when you look at the top four players in that IDS, Pakistan realm, and I say that tongue in cheek because I think they all have very strong merits and they're very important to this sector.
For sure.
Having said that, each of those logos, each of those brands are only as good as how well was that system architected, deployed, configured, and tuned. And I think that's where a lot of these companies are missing, quite frankly, in the adoption and rollout of these technologies. And then what they find out is they're not realizing the value they thought they would. They've spent millions, and then it becomes, we bought the wrong technology. Well, did you? Because we can't lose sight of, you have to go after these engineering designed and built systems with an engineering approach.
Yeah, and I saw a quote that I really like, and it's been in the last three weeks to a month, where visibility without context is just noise. Again, if you're not going to contextualize the data, and let's be honest, these technologies provide a lot of very valuable data, both from a process integrity and a cyber aspect. But where organizations, in my opinion, fall a little short is understanding, interpreting those insights, and then using that data to make actionable risk decisions based on the organization's purpose, the organization's direction, and how they can better understand that data and what it means to them moving forward.
So I definitely would disagree with that point, but I would maybe unpack that a little bit and say, I think there's a bigger issue at play. So let's just take a use case of a global manufacturer with 100 sites globally, right?
Okay.
And I think you know as well as I do that more than likely that company acquired a good percentage of those sites through acquisition, right? Over decades. So what you end up with is many different types of facilities with many different types of industrial automation solutions, whether it's Schneider or Siemens or Rockwell, and there's never a single logo at any given site. That's the reality, right? And it's very complex. So I think one thing that's interesting, Craig, is where did the budget come from that initial acquisition of that technology? Whether that was a Clarity, a Dragus, Nozomi, Armis, whatever the case may be, was that funded through security's budget, through the CISO? Was it funded through operations? Because where that funding originated might drive how that adoption and initiative was executed and deployed, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's interesting because the reality is most organizations, when you talk about context, you don't necessarily have the context of those 100 sites. What are the architectures? So, for example, am I just connecting to a span port of that core switch? Right? Where the reality is that control system layer, that critical control layer, where these are in terms of the Internet of Things speak, This is the things that tell the things what to do, right? The PLCs, the motion controllers, DCS controllers. At that layer, they are typically inside a control cabinet. In that control cabinet, you've got the IO, you've got the PLC, you got a nice little HMI in the door of the panel, right? Some VFDs, the variable frequency drops, and 99% of the communication is east-west across that cabinet. It doesn't even go up the trunk of the switch.
True.
So what does that really mean? That means the shiny object, technology is not getting access to that data unless that SCADA server is acquiring some of that telemetry from that. So that's the real challenge, because now you're, as an organization, you're making a decision. Are we trying to get the technology deployed as a first wave initiative across all 100 sites first, and then go back with a secondary analysis of, okay, what is our level of visibility? Are we achieving 80% visibility, 70%, 60%? Because if we don't do that secondary work, don't we have a false sense of security of what's on our network?
Yeah, and back to the purchasing portion of that, we're starting to see a shift, and I'm not sure yet what I think of that, but we're seeing a shift to the IT side as CISOs, CIOs are being tasked with holistically security for the enterprise, including the manufacturing. I would say the negative, if there's a part of that that's negative, which again, I don't know that it is, it's just different, is they normally run into a roadblock when they hit the plant floor, and you have a plant manager, or you have a controls engineer or a VP of engineering that says, well, hang on a minute. We can't do any of that without a shutdown. And our shutdown comes next July 4th, and we've got 3 weeks worth of stuff to put in 2 days. And we'll try and prioritize you, but there's no guarantee. So get on the list and submit it, and we'll see what happens. Versus the OT teams that might have procured one site because they were interested in the process integrity portion of the tool. They had OpEx budget for one site. They're leveraging it, but not so much globally for the entire enterprise because they own the assets. So that's the divide. And I would say that OT ecosystem needs to really kind of grow up a little and kind of own more of this and partnership with their IT counterparts to be more successful in a large-scale deployment.
I think that's accurate. What I would say, maybe to a slightly different direction, when you're looking at that global corporate entity, first of all, I completely agree that from what I'm seeing, yes, CISOs predominantly are on that trend of owning responsibility for OT cybersecurity. And what hasn't followed as clearly, though, is budget, right?
True.
And one thing that I think is really interesting is when you start looking at the problem globally, right? The real challenge, I think, is this goes beyond above the CISO. Because what you're talking about, the biggest challenge is really around governance and compliance and risk across that organization, right? So there has to be alignment even above that CISO. And I still maintain the best way to move forward is the cross-functional teams. So you have to put together these advisory boards that include the OT subject matter experts, the cross-domain experts of different security domains. Number one, I think politically, it's important from that alignment, but also technically that cross-pollination, because it's an aging workforce problem, right? So sure. We have to create the type of talent we need within these organizations. And that has been the best tool I've seen to solve some of these challenges, is really bringing these communities together, because it takes a village. It really does.
I would agree 1,000% with that. And we see that from a resource standpoint, not only internally, but externally within organizations that are trying to to hire, that are trying to grow the talent because it's not available to hire. What we haven't seen yet, that I hope we see more of soon, are universities, education systems that are beginning to foster programs that teach OT cyber, similar to what they're doing on the IT side. But you look at IT and the 30-year head start they've got on the OT side. We're still in the early stages. In the last 6 or 8 years, this is all relatively new, and it's not. It takes time. Rome wasn't built overnight.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is where I think you have to give some of the vendors some credit here, because how they acquire their talent, for the most part, at least I can speak to Rockwell and Siemens in this regard, is the engineering development leadership programs, right? Where the rising talent out of the universities, academia, and then bring them through 6-month rotations into different functions. And I think part of that is there's another side to this where Siemens or Rockwell both have programs where they're donating their equipment to the universities, because it's kind of go back to high schools back in the day. It used to be all Apple, right?
Yeah.
Which was a brilliant move, because then you're bringing all these people. Oh, hey, yeah, Siemens. I know the Siemens system. That's what
I trained on. Yeah.
Right. So I think everyone is trying to do their part, and I'm starting to see a lot more programs. So that's great news. Mm-hmm. But every time I'm talking, especially at the plant manager level, when I'm doing global assessments, and one of the things I like to talk to the plant managers about is what they're seeing in terms of the aging workforce problem. And without a miss, every single one of them, it's one of the biggest issues they face is on the talent. This is what scares me the most right now, because once we lose that subject matter expertise that's inherent of the critical, you lose the operational resilience.
No, without doubt.
Back to your context point, in terms of the analyst within the SOC, if you don't have that context, well, then you have risk.
Well, without doubt, totally agree. And I don't know if it's a stigmatism that manufacturing is not cool and sexy, if it's people or young talent is looking at the IT side, because again, let's face it, you're refreshing technology every 3 to 5 years. It's all new, it's all shiny, it's all cool. You get down to the manufacturing, you're dealing with a 30, 40, 50-year-old machine that's dirty and greasy, that had no thought of security when the machine was even made. It works. So the philosophy is, why upgrade it and fix it? It still works. It's making our widget and it's doing it finely. Why change something?
Yeah, it's making money, right?
Yeah.
There's another side of that coin, though, Greg, because this is my personal experience working with security researchers and security analysts, whether it's 1s and 2s within security operations centers.
Yeah.
Without a miss, every single one of them, they're so fascinated with the industrial control system world, or OT cybersecurity world. The idea that something could go boom instead of just shutting down a mail server, right? Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. And so every time I have whether I'm doing some type of a CMMI assessment for a SOC or whatever the case may be, that's always an engaging conversation where they're just hungry to learn more. So there's a hunger out there and fascination, but there's just the unknown. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
So somehow, some way, if we could bridge these gaps in these worlds, the appetite's there. Listen, I would say the same thing about some of the process control engineers and control system engineers that we have out. Give them the opportunity. I'll go back to that cross-domain, the cross-functional teams. If you do this in the right way, you have organizations that are hungry. We just have to break down the silos.
Well, and we see the same thing, Roger, across multiple verticals, multiple disciplines. When organizations work together, the OT and the IT teams, and they come together to solve the problem holistically, and they're trying to work, you use the talent and the skill sets from the IT side, and you apply the principles and the differences in the way that it works in the OT side, and you come with commonalities. everyone wins. The vendor wins because the software solutions providing is being utilized to its capacity. It's being leverage for what it's designed to be. The organization wins. They get the data they need. It can pump into multiple tools on the IT side to feed a SOC, a SIM, a SOAR, or whatever they want to get that data. It's being done correctly in a passive manner down on the OT side so it's not harmful. You begin building that trust between the two sides. Everybody wins. I think that that's the best scenario, whether that's a small facility with one or two sites all the way to a global organization with hundreds of sites in multiple countries.
Craig, I've always said when someone would ask me the question, what's the difference between OT SOC and, enterprise SOC? Three things: context, context, context.
Yeah.
That, tongue in cheek, but, the reality is it's understanding what is the impact if we're trying to look at some type of containment post-triage investigation, right? If we're looking at some kind of containment, what is that containment measure going to have an impact of that system, right? Let's take a typical type scenario of you get an alert that's suspicious configuration change of a controller, right? And it's coming from this IP address. Looking at your tech stack as an analyst, often you're dealing with the same tech stack. It's almost like overlapping Venn diagrams. There's a little bit of the tech stack that really needs to be focused on the OT systems.
Yep.
Otherwise, you can leverage other IT tool or attack, but it's different tooling and processes that are unique for the OT side. I've always maintained having your OT SOC as a subset of your enterprise makes perfect sense, because if you think about it, whether you have an MSSP or you're doing this yourselves with your SOC, your primary mission is to identify threats as they're traversing your business functions.
Right.
So OT is just another business function. Mm-hmm. So there has to be that cross, and plus you can extend the life cycle of your teams. Go from a tier 1 to tier 2, then rotate into the tier 1 of the OT, and you can double the lifetime expectancy of your talent pool. And listen, that's a big thing on the talent retention side.
Oh, for sure it is. And I would say from an OT-centric SOC, there has to be that content. You have to understand the why behind it. You look at the IT side, and it's isolate and remove. You can't do that safely on the plant floor without knowing what the implications of that are. And for manufacturers, they recognize that. So it's a different beast.
And that's the additional processes in place, right? Providing that context.
Yep.
Right? So I think that's what's crucial. And this is where there's a little bit more engineering work up front to provide that type of context for the analysts that are actually doing this work.
So if I were to kind of guess to think about the next 5 to 10 years, given what we've accomplished in the OT ecosystem in the last 7 or 8 years, let's call it 10 years, since these tools, technologies began emerging, organizations began thinking about this, where do we need to get in the next 5 to 10 to really begin making a difference?
Whoa, that's kind of loaded. What strikes me there, Craig, is so I've always been a little bit of a futurist, right?
Okay, good.
Formerly global head of technology management on the security services side of Siemens. That was really kind of one of the key capabilities in terms of that vision. What I would say is, a year ago, if you would have asked me that question, I think I could have given you a pretty decent answer. Now, I find myself much more unwilling to project beyond 2 years. I think what we've seen in the last year, just with generative AI and the LLMs, it's really changed. And what I mean by that mainly is the way adoption is happening. This is really disconcerting to me. is there's an adoption without discipline. There's an adoption without investigation. And I think this is going to come to a tipping point. And I'm afraid what that can actually mean. So I think looking at the potential of artificial intelligence for being able to identify and analyze vast amounts of data, absolutely, this is great. But I think what we have to do is do this in a responsible way. And, what is the biases that are inherent within these models?
Yeah.
These are the things that I'm really concerned about, because I think projecting beyond a year or two out now is actually very challenging. On the one hand, that's the pessimistic side. Now, on the optimistic side, it's very exciting times, because I think the future is all about integration. All of these silos of technology we have now will be broken down. It will all be about integration and having larger data lakes. Now, what becomes interesting at that plant level, and listen, we've seen some signs of this with some of the cloud interruptions that we've had, not to mention the latest CrowdStrike incident here, is the on-prem versus cloud, right? And what should be done at the edge in terms of pre-processing versus moving just that high-fidelity data up to the cloud, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting discussion for critical manufacturing and other critical sectors. What should be at the edge of the facility versus cloud?
Yeah, and we still see the adoption, depending on where the buying cycle is. If it's coming from an IT buyer, they're more comfortable in a cloud SaaS model. If it's coming from the OT buyers, they're traditionally in that, I want an on-prem solution still. So we're still seeing that.
I think there's an in-between world right now. So when you look at the digitalization initiatives, right, whether it's Industry 4.0 or any other type of digitalization initiative, what are you seeing in terms of the commonality of where that budget and where that is being driven from? Operations or IT?
We're still seeing operations in large CapEx budget for these type technologies where they're rolling it into other projects. IT is getting there. They're not quite there yet from the plant floor initiatives, from what we're seeing.
Interesting. So what I have seen is definitely a convergence of IT and OT. OT generally having the budgeting, owning the budgets, the digitalization initiatives. The part that is as consistent from what I'm seeing is bringing in cybersecurity into early planning and design.
100%, yes. For digitization, updating processes, controls, modernization, that is OT. That is by far 100% spot on.
It's such to be competitive in this global marketplace we have now, global manufacturing sector. It's imperative that they be able to make those decisions quicker.
Yes.
The shop floor. And so there's enormous pressure. But if I could get one message out, it's break down the silos, bring cybersecurity in on the earliest planning and design phases, not as an afterthought of just having control.
And I would say that for anybody listening, if there's one commonality that everybody that we talk to is saying, you have to start working together. You have to start taking steps now. You can no longer just ignore and say, it's not going to happen to us, or we're immune, or pick a reason or an excuse is really what it is. But organizations have to start doing something to get better, and they can't ignore it. That's a great piece of advice. So this conversation could go for days, Roger, and I don't think that we're going to solve anything, but hopefully the listeners can take out of this a few ways or some opportunity that they can look internally, look at their own processes, look at their own teams and say, hey, do we have what we need as an organization to sit down together with C-suite, operations,
Absolutely.
IT, and begin addressing. There's going to be more questions than there are answers initially, and every organization goes through that. But again, you have to have the conversations.
Go through the exercise of a day in the life, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And listen, I think for the most part, you'll be surprised at how receptive other organizations will be when it's done in the right way.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because then you start to appreciate some of the things that are signed. And
if you're the CIO or you're the CISO and you're leaving a board meeting and you're being tasked with security for the manufacturing side of your organization, my recommendation, your very first stop is Red Wing Boot Store and buy yourself a pair of steel-toed shoes. Call the plant manager and say, hey, I've got this new initiative and I'd like to come sit in your office for a couple hours and I would like you to walk me through our manufacturing process. I want to see what it involves. And I don't want to look at it from the mezzanine. I want to be on the floor.
You know where it starts? Show up, have the CIO or the CISO show up at 7 a.m., stand up for lean manufacturing.
Yeah.
They will always be amazed. Agile, I know Agile from software development. It originated from lean manufacturing, right? And go through the management of change meetings. And I think there's an appreciation of, wow, there's much more to this.
Yes.
The lean processing, there is more in common than you would actually think.
Yep.
And it's a great foundation to build from.
Yep. Nope, I agree. Thank you very much for your time, Roger. I really appreciate you being on the show. Hopefully the listeners were able to get some good feedback. And, until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.